I'd like to welcome all of you today. We're going to be presenting on the what, why, and how of solving for the most vulnerable. This is our first session in the series, and so we're hoping that you find the information engaging and informative. Our agenda for the day is we're going to review our commitments as always. Then we're going to talk about what does it even mean to solve for the most vulnerable, why we should do it, how we do it, and lastly, we'll talk a little bit, like very little, about what's next in the series. As with all our Jedi sessions, this will be a brave space, which calls for us to identify and address our individual fears and discomforts while creating a safe space for others to do the same. This means that everyone attending is expected to agree to the following. Agree to actively and compassionately listen. Agree not to devalue anyone else's experiences, so no arguing or demanding of proof. Agree to bravely speak of our own experiences using I statements as much as possible. Agree to share space by not talking over and cede the floor gracefully if you notice someone would like to speak. We can use the up hand emoji thing on Google. And agree to respectfully exit upon request. This does mean that if I believe you're making the space unsafe with your presence, I will ask you to step away for a while, reflect, and rejoin later. Okay, so let's get into the solving for the most vulnerable thing. So solving problems is a process of finding a solution to a problem. And we solve problems all the time. Some are mundane, like figuring out how to satisfy our lunchtime hunger. And some are more complex, like figuring out how to build a new feature. Let's imagine, or rather think back to a time when we had to plan a dinner for family and friends. That's a pretty mundane activity. I'd like you to really think about the process that you did or would use to solve this problem. And what are some of the things you took into consideration? Did you consider maybe finding a time that works for the most people? What about a location that's convenient for the majority? Thinking about what works for most people is pretty standard in party planning. To identify means to recognize, which means that to identify a problem, we have to be able to recognize that a problem exists. We have to be aware of ourselves, our others, and our environment. If you ever get that itchy feeling that something is off, that's probably a good signal that something's going on and we should turn up our attention. This awareness is really important because not all problems that we may encounter have an obvious direct impact on us, so it might not even feel like a problem. Let's take, for example, if you have access to and or carry debit or credit cards, businesses that don't accept paper money may not seem like a problem because you're not affected. But we know from being aware of others that not everyone has this access. So businesses not accepting paper currency is a problem because those folks without cards are unable to complete their transactions. This is a clear example of there being a willingness or desire to take an action that is being impacted by an external factor. In this case, the business's choices on which payment types to accept. Problems generally have some internal and or external factors impacting the situation. Internal factors are generally those that are, or at least appear to be, within our means of control, like willingness, availability, and finances even. External factors are generally those that are, or at least appear to be, outside of our control, such as systemic oppression or physical barriers to entry. So let's try this problem solving thing out. Identification thing. Looking at this picture, what are we immediately aware of? What internal factors are impacting the children's ability to participate in viewing the game? What external factors are impacting the children's ability? Is there a problem? Well, from my perspective, the children aren't necessarily being impacted by internal factors. They seem to want to watch the game, yet they are being impacted by external factors because there's a wooden fence all up in their way. So I'd say that's a problem. The most vulnerable is the person or group of people who are most susceptible to risk and or in the greatest need of support. Who the person or group is that is most susceptible to risk may change depending on the context of the situation or problem. Perhaps it is someone like me who has a prosthetic leg that can't get wet in a situation where we're going to be near water. Or maybe it's a user who's blind and needs to navigate a web application to pay a bill. Or those in our society who are already food insecure during an economic downturn. The person or group who needs the greatest support may also change depending on the context. An example from our society here would be determining who gets a stimulus check from the government during this economic downturn. The point here is that in almost every situation, there is someone who is at a greater risk of harm and or in greater need of support than others. In your imagined party plans, did you consider who on the guest list has food allergies? Like, if our bestie has an allergy to nuts, we wouldn't serve PB&Js, even if it was everyone's favorite. On our project teams, we think about who has outside obligations when we're scheduling meetings. We think about our users and the accessibility of our applications. On a regular basis, we consider who is the most vulnerable and their specific needs when we're solving a problem. Solving for the most vulnerable is a problem-solving perspective that centers the needs of the person or group that is most susceptible to risk or has the greatest need of support. We just acknowledged that we do this on a regular basis without much thought. So this process being presented today is really about leveraging what we already do and using the skill with intention. We want to intentionally think about a problem from the perspective of the most vulnerable. We want to make them the model for our design solution, and we want to set our success criteria based on what success means for them. We want to be consciously solving to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. To identify the most vulnerable within the context, we need to perform a risk needs analysis. We know that the most vulnerable is the person or group that is most susceptible to risk or in the greatest need of support. We also know that context matters. So we're going to consider which individuals are or could be impacted by the problem and how those individuals may be or are being impacted differently. From there, we can organize those within the context by degree of risk susceptibility and need of support. Often in this, you'll find that those with the highest susceptibility to risk also have the greatest need of support. It may be helpful to compare this with prioritizing work by urgency and importance. Work that is both urgent and highly important is prioritized to be done first. Organizing our problem data this way will help us in designing a solution. So let's go back to the game. Looking at this image again, which child is most susceptible to risk or in the greatest need of support? Who would we select as the model for solving this problem? First, we ask, what context is the problem being presented in? And the problem seems to be that the kids couldn't see a baseball game on a baseball field because of a wooden fence. Who is or could be impacted? Well, in this case, it's the 3 children outside the fence. How might they be impacted differently? Well, if we look, the tallest child doesn't really seem to need any assistance, as they can already see over the fence. Their arm is leaning on the board, so they might be susceptible to a splinter. The middle child's view is blocked by maybe a foot of fence, so they do need a small boost so that they can see. And here too, there's a risk of splinters. The smallest child, though, they're blocked by about 2 feet of fence. This means that they need the largest boost so that they can see. And again, still wood, still splintery. So who is the most susceptible to risk? I think in this case, given In this case, all children have an equal risk of getting a splinter. Who is the greatest need of support? Well, from our analysis, I think we can agree that the smallest child has the greatest need of support because they would need to make up the most distance so they could see over the fence. Based on the above, who is the most vulnerable in this context? The smallest child has both risk of getting a splinter and the greatest distance to make up to see the game. Given that, I propose that the smallest child is the most vulnerable. So far, we've learned that we are natural problem solvers and that we can increase our conscious awareness of our abilities by raising our awareness of ourselves, others, and our environments. We've learned that the most vulnerable is the person or group that is most susceptible to risk or in the greatest need of support. We've also learned that solving problems for the most vulnerable is a perspective that centers the needs of the most vulnerable. Lastly, we've learned that our natural abilities extend to our subconscious identifying of the most vulnerable, and that here too we can make this move from subconscious to conscious by completing a risk needs analysis and gathering data. But I'm sure you're like, that's all great, but why should we bother to do this? Well, what if this was our child and we got up early on a sunny spring day to take them to the game, but instead of getting seats, our little one wants to stay with their friends? While we may not be super excited about sitting in the sun for 9 innings, we would oblige them, flip open our folding chairs, and settle in. But what if we then looked up and saw this? Well, because it's our child, we're going to care a lot that they can't see the game, right? We're going to want to solve this problem because we care about our child's needs. Considering someone's needs is a great way to demonstrate that we have care for them. From our previous section, we can see that considering dietary needs and individual schedules is a routine act of care we engage in for those we are in relationship with. And if those were the only problems we ever solved, showing that we care would be enough for me. But we know that those are just one kind of problem we come across. So while that showing of care is important, we are also going to look at some other reasons that solving for the most vulnerable is something we should do. So let's eliminate our early imaginings. This ain't our child. We aren't sitting in folding chairs personally impacted by their inability to see the game. We're in our homes participating in a virtual session on solving for the most vulnerable. That said, this is still a problem. Solving for the most vulnerable creates solutions that are better designed, have a positive impact on the most people, and have less unintended side effects. I know that's a huge claim, but let's just assume it's true and continue exploring. In project development, we gather requirements from our clients, and we generally don't take them as they are and just plop them right in a JIRA. Usually, we meet as a team to refine them into features and stories. This does 2 main things. It helps clarify the team what the work really is, because the team's going to read through the requirements, ask a bunch of questions, do some research, and then they can specify what really needs to happen, which allows for the second thing, organizing and prioritizing the work into playable bites. This process allows us to create better solutions for our clients. Write code that is more sturdy and reliable for our users with fewer bugs for us to hunt down later. We do this because we know a better designed process leads to better outcomes. So just like we don't work from raw requirements, we shouldn't work from our initial problem evaluation. Instead, after we have identified the problem and the most vulnerable, we need to refine our problem statement from the perspective of the most vulnerable. This way, we can clarify what work actually needs to happen and organize and prioritize that work. Doing this will require us to step into their shoes, as the saying goes, so we can look at the problem from the point of view of the most vulnerable and understand their needs. In the real world, that would mean we need to be intentionally curious, researching and asking questions. We need to ensure that we do not make assumptions. We need to believe what people tell us about their experiences. Most importantly, whenever and wherever We follow the lead of the most vulnerable. We work from a position of support, providing assistance as we are asked to. In the world of the session, we're just going to revisit the kids at the ballpark. Let's start by refreshing our memory. Our initial problem was that the kids can't see the game because of the height of the fence. Our risk needs analysis told us that the most vulnerable in this context is the smallest child because they have the greatest need. This isn't the real world, so we can't ask the children questions, nor can we research information about the baseball field. So for this exercise, we'll just have to pretend that we did. What is the smallest child aware of? The smallest child told us that they're aware that they can't see the game because of the boards. And the internal factors the child says is impacting the situation is that there aren't any. They really want to see. They are ready to see. And they can't help how tall they are. When we asked about external factors, the smallest child said that they can't see the boards. It's a barrier to their access. Based on that, what is our refined problem? I propose that it is the smallest child can't see the game because of the height of the boards. So we know what it means to solve for the most vulnerable and why we should do it. Now, let's talk a little bit about how. This may sound pretty simple. There are only 4 steps, and didn't I just say that this is something we do on a regular basis? And if you've been paying attention, you'll probably have recognized that we walked through 3 of them. That thought is fair. But I do want to caution you here. The process, as shown, is simplified so we can take our first bite at it. It is in no way meant to trivialize the work, nor make it seem like this is something that won't be a challenge to fully implement. Because as we will see, as we continue through our series, there are layers to this. But for now, our focus is on moving our unconscious solving for the most vulnerable to our consciousness. We want to be able to do it on purpose, with intention, and a commitment to growth. Thus far, we have used our kids at the game problem to identify the problem. We turned on our awareness and we looked at the image and were able to identify that the height of the wooden fence was obscuring the view for the children. We were able to identify the most vulnerable within this context. We completed a risk needs analysis, and in that we found that the height of the boards was blocking the view for 2 of the children and posing a risk of splinters to all of them. This allowed us to identify the most vulnerable as the smallest child in the presented context. Then we were able to refine the problem from the perspective of the most vulnerable. We put ourselves in the perspective of the smallest child and were able to narrow our problem statement to the smallest child cannot see the game because of the height of the boards. So, what is step 4? Designing a solution is step 4. And designing a solution to the refined problem requires that we maintain the perspective of the most vulnerable. We hold it while ideating possible solutions. We continue to hold it while investigating if our ideas will solve the refined problem, and keep on holding it as we interrogate if our ideated solutions introduce unintended side effects. I want to pause here to note a point that I think is very important. It is not possible to be side effect free. More importantly, that is not our goal. We are focused on intention. We want to be aware of possible side effects and the possible consequences of them. We never want side effects to cause additional harm to our most vulnerable. So we want to make conscious decisions on which side effects we are accepting so that we can be prepared to address the outcomes of those side effects. So let's go back to our kiddos and take a look at step 4. This image might seem familiar. That's because this one is used a lot to describe the difference between equality and equity. But I think it will help us with this step. So, we're ideating possible solutions. And we can see in our second panel, the solution of giving each child one box does not solve the problem for our most vulnerable child. So that's kind of a no-go off rip. In the third panel, we can see that giving the smallest child the tallest child box boosts the most vulnerable enough for them to see the game. But have you ever seen a child stand perfectly still for hours? No? Neither have I. So let's just say our most vulnerable child gets excited at a home run and starts jumping up and down while perched on those two boxes. What could be the outcome of that? Well, they could fall, right? And who wants to go to the children's hospital on a sunny day? Nobody. That's who. So this is a side effect, and it's not one that we are willing to accept. We looked at two possible solutions and we asked, does the proposed solution solve the refined problem? And we saw that providing one box to each child does not solve the problem, and providing two boxes to the smallest child did. Then we thought about possible side effects. And we looked at the side effect of giving the most vulnerable child two boxes, and were able to identify a fall risk. The consequences of the side effects on the most vulnerable would be a possible physical injury that could be serious. And after looking at that, we were able to consciously not accept this side effect. So, what are we to do? Well, what if we just remove the boards entirely? Would it solve our refined problem? Looks like it. But what about our earlier claim? Did we prove that solving for the most vulnerable creates the best designed solution that has positive side effects on the most people with the fewest unintended side effects? Well, did our process create a solution that has positive impacts on most people? Given that without any boards, any person, regardless of height, will be able to see the game played on the field, and there's no more worries about splinters, I think we can say it did. Did our process create a solution that helped us integrate and consciously accept side effects, thereby reducing unintended consequences? Well, if this was the real world, if there is an adequate distance between the ball fields and the spectators, it could increase the risk from being hit by foul balls. We also want to think about the ages of the children playing, because we wouldn't want them to be able to wander off the field without supervision. But since we're staying in the context of this cartoon, the answer is no. We saw possible outcome side effects of providing two boxes to our most vulnerable would be a fall risk, and we determined that it wasn't acceptable. Removing all the boards has no side effects in this picture, unintended or otherwise, which means to me the process did what we wanted. Did our process create a solution that is better designed? Well, the solution solves the refined problem. It actually solves the initial problem too. Everyone can see, so there's a positive impact on the most people, everyone in this case. It doesn't have side effects, and the work of taking down the boards seems pretty straightforward of a solution. So did we meet our claim that the process of solving for the most vulnerable creates better solutions that have a greater positive impact for everyone and fewer unintended side effects? I think so. To summarize, we covered what? And now we understand that solving for the most vulnerable means centering on who is the most vulnerable within the context of the problem when designing a solution. A gentle reminder that harm has many forms and context matters, so we can and should leverage this process in all problem-solving situations. We want to ensure that we schedule our meetings so that our team members can take care of other obligations and still provide their expertise to our projects. We want to plan a meal that everyone can partake of, and we want to design accessible applications so our disabled users can use them. Then we covered why. And this helped us understand that solving for the most vulnerable provides better solutions because it provides a greater positive impact for the most people with fewer unintended side effects. Throughout, and finally, we covered how. So we should feel confident to know that we can practice solving for the most vulnerable by identifying the problem, by being aware even beyond our own interest. Identifying the most vulnerable within the context of the problem by doing a risk needs analysis. Refining the problem from the perspective of the most vulnerable by stepping into their shoes. Then we can design a solution to the refined problem while making sure that we look for side effects and be conscious of which we are accepting. I hope you all enjoyed the session today, and I hope you learned something and feel a little more capable of rising to the challenge of evolving our lens. In the next session, we are going to talk about how justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion plays a role in our efforts to solve for the most vulnerable. One last thing. If you're interested in reflecting more on this information, you should try out the session activity that's available in our Basecamp. Just look under Jedi, Solving for the Most Vulnerable, Session 1, and you'll be able to access this recording and a written version of the presentation. And with that, I thank you, and I officially end the presentation.